Hello everybody and welcome to another one of Mr. Deeping Science lessons. For today's session you're going to need a book, a pen and a worksheet that you can download in the link below. In your books I'd like to get down today's title, which is Flowers and Pollination, and for your starter activity I would like you to answer these two questions. Number 1, why are bees attracted to flowers? And number 2, why do flowers need pollen? I'm going to put 5 seconds on the clock, and if you need more time, pause the video, and when you're finished, we'll go through the answers together. Did you suggest some answers? Bees are attracted to flowers because flowers contain sweet-smelling nectar and because they are brightly coloured. And flowers need pollen so that they're able to reproduce. Pollen is the equivalent of the male sex cell in plants. In today's lesson we are going to label the reproductive organs of a plant, we're going to explain how the reproductive organs are adapted to their function, and we're going to describe the difference between wind-pollinated plants and insect-pollinated plants. For our first task you're going to need the worksheet. If you haven't got a worksheet, don't worry about it, but you're going to need to copy this diagram in your books. I'm going to be labelling the parts of the flower on my diagram, and as I go through it I'd like you to label yours as well. And as we label this flower, I'd also like you to consider which parts of the flower are going to be considered the male parts of the flower and which parts of the flower are going to be considered the female parts of the flower. So starting right at the top then, we've got the stigma, which is considered a female part of the flower. Down from the stigma we've got the style, and down from the style in the middle we've got our ovary. These 3 parts of the flower are considered the female parts of the flower. This brightly coloured yellow bit is the petal, and then over on the other side you've got the anther, and that anther is held up by a filament. This anther and filament are considered the male parts of the flower. Below the filament we've got the sepal, and holding the whole flower up is the stem. Collectively, this stigma, style and ovary, these female parts of the plant, are called the carpel, and the anther and the filament, the male parts of the plant, are called the stamen. So now we've labelled the reproductive organs of a plant. In order to help us establish all the functions of all the parts of this plant, I would like you to get down this table in your books. It's got 2 headings and it goes down 9 lines. Our headings are part of the flower and function. And we are going to be using the information contained in the worksheet below to help fill out this table. If you haven't got the worksheet, don't worry about it, I'm going to put the information here. And so our task is to use this information to complete the table we've just drawn. And if you really want a challenge, I'd also like you to suggest what else might attract insects to flowers. I'm going to put 5 seconds on the clock, and if you need more time, pause the video, and when you're finished, we'll go through the answers together. If you filled out your table, let's have a look at it. At the very top of the plant we've got our stigma. This is a sticky layer which sticks out at the top and it's there to catch pollen. Just beneath that we've got the style, and the style connects the stigma to the ovary. The ovary is the place where the flower stores all of its egg cells to be fertilised by the pollen. Our bright yellow petals are there to attract insects, and therefore it's going to aid the pollination of the plant. The anther is the part of the plant which produces the pollen. The filament, just below the anther, is there to hold the anther up. These sepals are what protected the plant when it was just a young shoot, but in the adult plant they still remain. And right at the bottom we've got the stem, and the stem is there to hold up the plant. Did you have a go at the challenge? If you did, we're going to look at it in a lot more detail in the next task. So now we've explained how the reproductive organs of our plant are adapted to their function. Either pollinated by insects, where the insects will take pollen from one plant to another plant, or it can be pollinated by the wind, in which wind blows the pollen away from one plant and then by chance it lands on the stigma of another plant. Plants which are pollinated by insects tend to have the same characteristics. They often have bright coloured flowers and are very sweet smelling in order to attract insects. They're sweet smelling because our flowers contain nectar. Now these plants often contain very little quantities of pollen, but that pollen that it does produce is very sticky so that when insects do come to the plant, it latches onto the insect. Our anther, which produces the pollen, and our stigma, which receives the pollen, are often contained within the petals of the flower. This is so when an insect tries to retrieve the nectar by going into the flower, it is forced to brush against the anther and brush against the stigma. The stigma within an insect-pollinated plant are also sticky so that the pollen can stick to it. Our wind-pollinated plants often have small petals. This is because they don't need to attract any insects. And because we're not trying to attract any insects, these wind-pollinated plants often are dull in colour and contain no nectar. Because the probability of our wind carrying our pollen from one plant onto the stigma of another plant is fairly low, these plants produce pollen in large quantities in order to increase their chance of fertilization. And our pollen of our wind-pollinated plants also has a much lower mass, so the wind can blow it further away. The anthers for these plants are often much larger than the flowers, so that the wind can access the pollen and blow it away. You will also see this with the stigma of the plant, where it hangs outside of the flower to increase its chances of catching pollen. For our next task, I'd like to use the worksheet in which there are 10 pictures of flowers, and I want you to say whether or not they are insect-pollinated or wind-pollinated flowers based on their appearance. Don't worry if you haven't got a worksheet, I'm going to be displaying the flowers on the screen 2 at a time. Contained within these 10 flowers is one plant which is not pollinated by insects or wind, and I want you to try and spot that. And if you still want a challenge, I want you to suggest why wind-pollinated plants do not need to be brightly coloured. Our first 2 plants are the lily-pilly and the blackberry, and I want you to use the information to explain whether or not this plant is wind-pollinated or insect-pollinated. Now, in an explain answer, I want you to say whether it's wind or insect-pollinated and give the reason why. I'm going to put 5 seconds on the clock. If you need more time, pause the video, and when you're finished, we'll go through these answers together. Have you got your answers ready? Our lily-pilly is insect-pollinated. We can tell this because it has brightly coloured flowers, and the anther cannot be seen, so it must be contained within the flower. Our blackberry is a bit sneaky because the focus of the photo is the blackberry itself, but in the background you can see this white. It's insect-pollinated because it's got brightly coloured flowers. Our next 2 plants are the caramoo and the acacelowana. I want you to use the information to explain whether or not they're wind-pollinated or insect-pollinated. Remember, give your answer and the reason why. I'm going to put 5 seconds on the clock. You need more time, pause the video, and when you're finished, we'll go through the answers together. Have you got your answer? Our caramoo is wind-pollinated. We can tell because it's very dull in colour and it's got very large filaments which you can see coming out of the plant. This acacelowana is bird-pollinated. This is the red herring that was in there. And it's difficult to place in either insect-pollinated or wind-pollinated because it's got a brightly coloured flower, but it does have anthers which are sticking out of the plant and are clearly visible. The next 2 plants I would like you to identify as wind or insect pollinated are this Quercus and this Plantago, and remember to explain your answer, say whether it's wind or insect pollinated, and then give the reasons why. I'm going to put 5 seconds on the clock, and if you need more time, pause the video, and when you're finished, we'll go through the answers together. Have you got your answer? Our Quercus is wind-pollinated, and you can tell this because it's got dull colours, it's got large filaments, and there are a lot of filaments, so they're going to be producing a lot of pollen. This Plantago plant is also wind-pollinated, and you can tell because it's got large filaments, the stigmas are also visible, the anthers are visible, and it has no petals. Our next 2 plants are lavender and buttercup. I want you to say whether or not they're wind or insect pollinated and explain why. 5 seconds on the clock. You need more time, pause the video, and when you're finished, we'll go through the answers. You got your answers? Our lavender is insect pollinated, and we know because it's got colourful flowers, it's fragrant, and the anthers are not visible. Our buttercup is also insect pollinated. You can tell because it's got colourful flower and the petals are really large. Our last 2 plants then are the pansy and the tulip. I want you to say whether or not they're wind or insect pollinated and give the reason why. I'm going to put 5 seconds on the clock. You need more time, pause the video, and when you're finished, we'll go through the answers together. Have you got your answers? Our pansy is insect pollinated. We can tell because it's got brightly coloured flowers, it's got large petals, and the anthers aren't visible. It's very much like our tulip, which we can say is insect pollinated because it's got colourful flowers, large petals, and the anthers aren't visible. For those who had a go at the challenge, wind-pollinated plants don't need to be brightly coloured because they don't need to attract insects. So now we've described the difference between a wind-pollinated plant and an insect-pollinated plant. We've got one more thing to do before we wrap this lesson up. I would like you to suggest why some plants have fruit. I've also put some hints on the side to guide you. What do fruits contain? What animals will eat the food? And when they do eat it, is all of that food digested? And if you still need a challenge, why is a tomato classified as a fruit? If you've made any really good suggestions, I'd like to hear about them down in the comments below. But from me, I hope you've had a great lesson, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching the lesson. If you found it useful, don't forget to press the like button, and why don't you subscribe and press the bell icon as well so you know when the next lesson's available. You can also support me on Patreon, and you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and I appreciate all the support. And I'll see you next time.